Everyone, welcome to Foresight Intelligent Corporation Group. Really happy to have somebody here in this chat. Also, thank you so much, last time, for joining for Mark Miller's presentation, which was really not very long ago. And so it's good to see so many of you repeatedly now. And before we hit the road on today's presentation, I just want to do some bit of housekeeping, which I had forgotten in the previous one. But basically, many of you, I think the virtual groups are really wonderful. Really very much enjoy that. But many of you, I think, always ask me, like, when we do things in person again, and we just had the cryptography security AI workshop. But if you do want to come and meet many people in this group and across other groups at Foresight in person, our vision weekends are coming up. One of them will be at the Internet Archive and across a few Bay Area locations, and one will be again in a castle outside of Paris. So if you want to see folks from this group and other groups, then that's our annual kind of end of the year festival. So really inviting you to join there. There's also applications for subsidized tickets, and it's usually the really fun weekend that we have at the end of the year. Okay, I'm going to share more info about that in the chat, but that's really it from me from now. I'm really excited to finally welcome Mahendra. Thank you so much for being so patient with us. You've been nominated a while ago already at this point, but we're really excited to hear you on Concordant multi-agent systems. I'm going to share a lot more info about you in the chat here. Really excited also for the Q&A. It seems like you're really at the intersection between different fields, which is exactly what we're hoping to support here. So thanks a lot for joining. The stage is yours, and I'll be in the chat monitoring for questions.
All right, folks, nice to meet you all. Sorry for the multiple delays. We could do a short one-act play about all the comedy of errors that happened trying to get this presentation, but I'm glad that it's working right now. Hopefully it keeps working. I'm a PhD candidate in the political science department at UC Berkeley. I restarted the EA group at UC Berkeley. I've published in AI Magazine and Artificial Intelligence Safety and Security, also popular publications like the San Francisco Chronicle, and been on KCBS's State of California report and other stuff. Most of my research is on social choice and value alignment. And I'm going to focus, let me give a little background. So there's 3 levels of discourse I see. So one being popular discourse, another being policymaking discourse, and another being technical discourse. And I think all 3 levels are important. And most of my research is focused on the technical research. Some of the articles I had in Artificial Intelligence Safety and Security and my talk at EA Global. But what I'm going to focus on here is primarily in terms of stuff that I think would be used for popular and policymaking discourse. Because I think in terms of this, if this was like 10, 15 years ago, I probably would have focused on technical. But I think a lot of the technical stuff's been starting to bear fruit, and it'd be good to get a lot of the stuff into popular into policymaking discourse. There are a few takeaways I hope we'll have from this. One is that when we say majority rule, we should need consent of the majority and not majority preference. And that'll be a little more clear what that means a little bit later. Also, I think that people like Condorcet, the 18th century mathematician, philosopher, French revolutionary, and Condorcet's jury theorem should definitely be much more used in the popular discourse, especially if we want to promote better discussions of cooperation and intelligence explosions. And then also, I think, say, multi-agent systems can be a useful framework for framing a public policy discourse, and they could give some guidance on technical research. So when it comes to group decision-making, there are basically 2 parts. One is the aggregation of individual inputs into a group decision, and then there's also the background conditions under which individuals choose their inputs. So the section on majority rule is going to focus on the aggregation, and the stuff on Condorcet's jury theorem will focus on background conditions. When philosophers and modelers talk about majority rule, they're often talking about 2 different things. So when you see philosophers like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau talk about majority rule, they often are talking about in terms of something what we would call consent of the majority, right? But when you see formal modeling, like people like Kenneth Arrow or Kenneth May, you tend to see them discuss the majority rule as majority preference. But these are 2 very different concepts. And this following example helps clarify that, right? So let's say you have 3 friends that are trying to decide which of 2 pizza pies to buy, right? And say that 2 of the friends prefer pepperoni over cheese, but they like both, so they would consent to either, right? And then the 3rd friend prefers cheese over pepperoni, but they'd only consent to cheese, right? So what you'll notice is that the majority preference is for pepperoni, but there's unanimous consent for cheese. So what happens is that if you use majority preference, you're going to choose a candidate that isn't consented to by everybody, even though there happens to be a candidate that's consented to by everybody. approval voting is a mechanism that allows you to choose the candidate that maximizes consent. The way to look at this, you can conceive of each candidate as a potential contract, right? And then when a voter examines a potential contract, they say, okay, yes, I approve of this because I'm willing to consent to this contract, or they don't consent to it because they don't approve it because they're not willing to consent to it, right? And so basically, the voter just says yes or no to each candidate. And then the approval rating of each candidate is the percentage of yeses that each candidate gets. And then whichever candidate has the highest approval rating, that is the greatest number of yeses, wins the election. So basically what you're doing with approval voting is you're maximizing the number of consenting voters, and you're also minimizing the number of voters who have some candidate imposed upon them who they didn't consent to. So I guess there could be a lot of Lockean, even Rousseauian implications for that. All right. So if you look at like the standard normative arguments for majority rule on two candidates in the literature, and in the political philosophy literature, you generally see 5 arguments. These are standard arguments. You see it's contractarian, epistemic, fairness, statistical, and the utilitarian argument. And most of these are based on theorems like Condorcet's jury theorem for epistemic or May's theorem for fairness and so forth. And the issue is that when you try to take more than 2 alternatives, 2 candidates, these 5 arguments can fail to generalize because majority preference is intransitive due to Condorcet's paradox. So I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Condorcet's paradox. I'll just go over a simple example of it. So let's say you have 3 voters and 3 candidates, and the first voter prefers A over B over C. The second voter prefers B over C over A, and the third voter prefers C over A over B. So what you'll notice is that a majority of voters, the first and third ones, prefer A over B. And a majority of voters prefer, namely the first and second voters, prefer B over C. So if majority preference were transitive, then this would imply that a majority of voters prefer A over C. But if you actually look at the second and third voters, you'll notice that they both prefer C over A. So the majority prefer C over A. So what you have is majorities of voters preferring A over B over C over A, which is akin to saying 3 is greater than 2 is greater than 1 is greater than 3. And this can be a problem if your goal is to choose the best candidates. It's like saying which is the largest number. It's not clear in that sense. So it's a similar kind of an analogy situation. So the thing that's nice about approval voting is that it's transitive. And what I've done in previous work, my articles from 2018 and 2019, is shown that you can generalize approval voting to multiple alternatives for all 5 arguments, basically. Basically, it's a good way of generalizing a majority rule to multiple alternatives in a meaningful way as consent of majority, as opposed to the problematic way with majority preference. Now, I discussed some details here regarding Arrow's theorem. We can go into detail with that if anybody has questions about that in the Q&A. One thing I want to talk about is manipulation. So there's a theorem called the Gilbert-Swarthwaite theorem and the other related results that say that basically practically speaking, no voting system is immune to voters misrepresenting their opinions to improve the outcomes of the elections. And this is basically the result that led to the development of the field of mechanism design. And the typical approach to deal with this is to say, okay, let's just make the voting method used so computationally intractable that finding optimal voting strategy is difficult, right? So that way presumably there wouldn't be an incentive to misrepresent one's preference in that situation. But I think this is a wrong approach because what it does is it basically gives an advantage to players who have greater computational resources. So, for example, the game of Go today is computationally intractable. And let's say I teamed up with one of the top players like AlphaGo or something like that, and I played against the world Go champion, right? I would absolutely crush them just because I have a resource advantage over them. But if we use that other definition of making it computation intractable to figure out optimal strategy, it would be arguably fair because nobody, even the best AIs, don't have the optimal strategy for Go, right? So what I think a more reasonable approach to this is to think about, okay, let's try to use a mechanism that makes determining optimal strategy easy or tractable, regardless of like computational resource inequality. So the analogy here would be a game like tic-tac-toe. If I take a really well-trained chicken, I could have them always tie in tic-tac-toe against anything DeepMind or OpenAI would put against it. And we can show with the Meyerson-Weber theorem. Meyerson is actually the Roger Meyerson who got a Nobel Prize for economics for his work on mechanism design. That basically shows that finding the optimal strategy for approval voting is tractable for virtually all players. So I think that's a really great result for that, because basically means it's fair to all players, basically, regardless of computational resource inequality. All right. Now, some of y'all are like, okay, this is theoretical stuff. What about the real world? So here's a real world example. So during the 2016 Republican nomination contest, the Wall Street Journal was conducting roughly monthly polls of nationally representative samples of Republican voters. And they asked subjects both for a plurality voting contest where each voter gives like only their top candidate. And then they also did approval voting contest where they asked them to mark each one that they're willing to support. So basically, yes or no on each one, right? And typically Trump would win the plurality voting contest because he'd get about 20 some odd % of the first place votes. And there were typically more than 6 candidates running. So that was enough to win with plurality voting. But and these polls lasted roughly about 13 months. He never, during any of those approval voting polls, did he ever come in first place by approval voting. But in fact, during the last 2 months of the race before he de facto won the nomination, he was first place by the plurality voting polls and last place by the approval voting polls. And you can actually see some of that data right here, where, for example, March 20, he was 12th place by approval, but he was late into plurality voting at that point. Like you see, basically under Trump plurality, he's consistently usually first or occasionally second, and a few times he wasn't, but virtually always first. But he was never in first place by Trump support. And you can see also the number of candidates he was competing against. So the takeaway with majority rule is that, first, is that I think consent of majority, that is approval voting, is a better generalization of majority rule to multiple alternatives than majority preference. And second, that changing our conception of majority rule can have a major implication on real world decision making. And there's actually several places that have implemented approval voting. So like the UN uses it to choose the Secretary General, like Fargo, North Dakota, and St. Louis have adopted it and basically starting to get majority support for candidates because of that. And then also that the largest 2 mathematical societies and the largest statistical society in the United States, they all use approval voting. And then like the Society for Judgment Decision Making, which is a society of psychologists who do decision science, like your Phil Petlocks and your Danny Kahnemans. That society uses approval voting, and so does the Society for Social Choice and Welfare, which is the society of basically people who study social choice, the science, selection science. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the Condorcet jury theorem. And I want to first start with an example. So let's say, suppose you're a journalist and you've received some information and you want to verify the information. So the question is, you're confronted with multiple sources regarding the information. What kinds of sources would you prefer? Would you prefer an honest source or a dishonest source? Would you prefer a knowledgeable source or an unknowledgeable source? Would you prefer a source that's independent, or would you prefer a source that's dependent on the information of others? And would you prefer fewer sources or more sources? Those are pretty obvious answers to those questions. Obviously, as a journalist, you perform more sources that are honest, independent, and knowledgeable, right? There's a theorem by Condorcet, again, back from the 1700s, that basically shows that if you have agents and they're confronted with a statement that's either true or false, and each agent honestly expresses their belief about the state of the statement, and each agent has a probability P of correctly determining the state of the statement, and then each judgment of an agent is made under IID assumptions that is statistically independent manner, then if P is greater than 50%, as the population of voters increases, the probability that the majority of agents is correct as quickly and asymptotically approaches 1. So this leads directly into Condorcet's political philosophy. So he lived during 1743 to 1794, and he argued in his philosophy that societies should have institutions that promote honesty, knowledge, and independent judgment in as many people as possible. Right? For example, he argued that society should have contract law and enforce it to increase honesty within society. He advocated for a free press and for universally free and accessible education, regardless of race or sex. And I think one interesting example is he argued back in the 1700s that when people voted, they should vote by mail instead of voting in person, because he feared that if people met in an assembly, they would start to form parties and factions. And if they formed parties and factions, then they would lose their independent judgments because they start voting along party lines. And so he argued that if people voted by mail, it'd be more difficult for voters to coordinate, and then you would have more likely that the judgments are going to be independent. And of course, he also argued for universal suffrage regardless of race, sex, sexuality, just to increase the number of agents who have access to all this knowledge and honesty and independence. And so basically what Condorcet in his political philosophy was arguing was that by promoting institutions that increase the number of people who are honest and knowledgeable and independent, you're basically turning society into a truth-seeking multi-agent system. And Condorcet was a pioneer. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the big figures of the line, he was a sexist, and Kant was another big figure. He was racist, but Condorcet is the earliest figure that I'm aware of who believed in equal rights regardless of race, sex, or sexuality. And I actually want to spend a little time about the journey because I think he's actually a very useful figure for public discourse. He was born in 1743 in France. He was a mathematician. He was one of the leading mathematicians of his time, made significant contributions to integral calculus and also to statistics. But he was also a revolutionary. Like, he was a major figure in the French Revolution. He was one of the leading figures of the Girondists, having constructed their draft of the Constitution. The Girondists were one of the two major anti-royalist factions. The other major faction of the other major anti-royalist faction were the Jacobins, and these were the faction that basically did the reign of terror that cut off everybody's heads. And when they came to power, they issued a warrant for Condorcet's arrest, effectively a death sentence. And this is largely due to Condorcet's staunch opposition to the state use of the death penalty. He was staunchly against the death penalty in principle. And so knowing that he was basically going to die if he got caught, he went into hiding. And Condorcet had long wanted to write a detailed technical book describing how that when humanity had institutions that promoted honesty and knowledge and independence in humanity, then this could effectively be a self-improving multi-agent system that could quickly and asymptotically approach perfect honesty. One thing he talked about is that, like, if society makes better group judgments, then that leads to a feedback loop of where individuals also have better judgment. So that increases, if we're using the simple model, that increases P. And then if you increase the P of the individuals, then that would increase the group judgments again, and then just come the autocatalytic process where it just keeps increasing. But he knew he might die, and he worried he wouldn't get a chance to write such a technical book. So he wrote what he thought would be an accessible summary that would be based primarily on historical arguments. And this became known as Sketch of Historical Picture of Progress of the Human Mind, which he wrote while he was in hiding. And basically, it's like a 10-chapter history of the world. And he argued that societies, like, for example, Athenian democracy, that possessed institutions that promoted honesty, knowledge, and independence, those societies' institutions recursively improved and could quickly and asymptotically make better judgments. But societies that lacked such institutions, such as late antiquity European societies, they tended not to make such advances, right? And basically, the jury theorem was the backbone of his argument. And basically, he argued that you could have these self-improving, if you have these recursively self-improving institutions, this could lead to great changes in humanity, including increases in human intelligence, indefinite increases in human intelligence, and indefinitely lengthening of human lifespans. And so he got caught, just to give the end of this story, basically, he got caught and died under mysterious circumstances in prison in 1794. 1795, Sketch gets published and becomes his most famous work. And in 1798, Malthus writes a essay on the principle of population, which was largely written as an argument to rebut Condorcet. And you can actually see, if you look at the first edition of Malthus' book, he mentions Condorcet as one of the people he's rebutting in the book. And 2 chapters, I think, in the first edition are dedicated to rebutting Condorcet. What I hope I've shown so far is the usefulness of Condorcet and his jury theorem as framing tools for popular discourse about intelligent cooperation. Now, there's still a lot of nuance that has to be dealt with. I think this is where, like, Condorcet multi-agent systems can come into place for policy-making discourse, basically a different level of discourse. The jury theorem, and the version I gave, is basically the most famous epistemic theorem that Condorcet found, but he actually developed several theorems for other sets of background conditions. For example, he showed that under one set of particular background conditions, like minority rule could be the best form of information aggregation. What this points to was that Condorcet wasn't looking at governance solely from the perspective of his jury theorem, though that did play a big part. He was actually looking at it from what we would today call a multi-agent systems perspective. So what do we mean by Condorcet multi-agent systems? And again, I'm focusing here from a policy-making discourse level, technical discourse level, so I'm not going to get in really technical details. But basically, the idea is you have a system of agents that's confronted with a statement that can either be true or false. And the variables affecting the agents are things like their degree of honesty, their degree of knowledge, the degree of independence. And then the system outputs, it aggregates the agent's judgments and outputs a social judgment on the state of the state, right? And I discussed some of this in my EA Global talk, Rational Group Decision Making. And I want to give an idea of how this can be useful in a very practical sense, right? So here's one example, right? So let's say you've got a small class of about 20 students of 3-year-old preschool students and one preschool teacher, and they're trying to decide when they should cross the street, right? And then let's assume that the students aren't knowledgeable about how to cross the street. Let's say they have a probability of 1% of being correct, and the teacher has, let's say, a 99% chance of being correct, right? And then also let's assume that there's a bully in the class such that whatever the opinion of that bully is the opinion adopted by other students in the class, right? Given those background conditions of the example, what is the best way to aggregate the information, right? We know that the students have low knowledge and they're highly dependent on the opinion of the bully. So we could actually model this with a multi-agent system, right? And that basically majority rule would be a very bad way of aggregating this information to choose how to cross the road. But given the background conditions, the best way to aggregate the information would be to basically let the teacher be a dictator in that situation. And you can formalize this with a multi-agent system. And it's a second question we want to ask is, okay, if we want the group to use a particular decision-making method, how should we change the background conditions to make that method effective? So the question becomes, okay, we want to use a particular method. How do we change the background conditions to make that method effective? Assuming that our ultimate goal, our method that we want used is that each student to eventually know how to decide when to cross the road independently of each other. If that's our goal, then what do we need to do to change the existing background conditions? We could develop 4 models for this. We show that, okay, we want to decrease the student's dependence on the bully's opinion, right? So we want to institute some sort of reforms or some sort of interventions to decrease the dependence on the bully. So maybe teaching people how to stand up to bullies or whatever, right? And then we also would want to increase each student's knowledge about crossing roads. So you'd want to maybe spend a few minutes explaining to them, okay, this is how you look both ways before you cross the road and all this other stuff, right? So basically the formal model could give us ideas about what kinds of changes we need to make sure that we can use a particular kind of method. That brings us to what the 2 main kinds of questions I think Condorcet and multi-agent systems can help us answer. One is, how should we aggregate information when confronted with a particular set of background conditions? And how should we change background conditions if we want to use a particular information aggregation method, right? But there's other things that we could potentially also try to answer with Condorcet and multi-agents. So one is like the expert independence, right? So obviously we're not going to be experts on everything. We're always have to be dependent on experts to some degree. But at the same time, like the more we depend purely on experts, the less independence there is in judgments to some degree, right? So the question is, how do you balance that out? And so having a formal model to tease that out would be very useful. Another one is deliberation group think from, right? So one thing you notice sometimes in focus groups is that initially the different members of the group will have different opinions, but then they start talking and then they all just line up to one opinion. Not necessarily that they were convinced, but because there's a basic group think phenomenon going on, right? And so you do want deliberation because you want a sharing of information, but at the same time, you want to maintain some sort of independence of judgments. So I think formal modeling of this could help. And then there's other questions like, how do you deal with deliberation mixed with polling? Because a lot of times once you have a poll done, it solidifies the public's opinion about things. Because they think, oh, Republicans are voting this way, so I need to think this way. Or Democrats are thinking this way, so I need to think this way. So the question is, how do we resolve that issue? And then there's other things we could do to improve deliberative democracy processes if we want, right? Now, here I want to move into some speculations about potential epistemic solutions to the collective action problem and also an idea for the epistemic foundation of the good, right? So to do this, let's start off with an example, right? So let's say we have a situation where you have 10,000 individuals confronted with a statement that's either true or false, and each individual has a probability 51% of correctly judging the state, right? And each agent is honest and each agent is making the judgment in a fiscally independent manner. Now, further, suppose you have another agent who is outside this group of 10,000, and let's say they're a genius and they have a probability of 99% of correctly determining the state of the state, right? So that's the basic situation. You have 2 societies, one of an individual genius and the one of 10,000 average people. Okay, assuming that our goal is to maximize the probability of correctness, we have a few questions here, right? So one question is, should individuals in the society abandon their judgments and simply adopt the judgment of the genius? Another is, should the genius seek to join the society and contribute their independent judgment to the aggregation of society's judgment? And a third one is, should the society accept the genius as another individual judgment in their society? All right. And we could answer this question. So with respect to the first question, the probability that the majority of the 10,000 individuals is correct is greater than 99%, given those background conditions. So if each of the individuals were to abandon their individual judgments, which have about 51% probability of correctness, and just adopt the opinion of the genius, so they, oh, I feel smarter because I'm just saying what the genius says, they would actually drop the correctness of that society of individuals, because they would lose their independence condition basically by doing that. And so they would drop their probability of correctness overall as a majority, right? In this particular situation, the individual should keep their individual judgment as opposed to just adopting the opinion of the genius. Now, of course, there are real world situations where you should adopt the opinion of the genius. For example, if you had a much smaller population of people, right? And then second, should the genius seek to join society? Assuming that they want to be correct, they would want to become the 10,001th member of society and contribute their judgment, their independent judgment, to the aggregation, because that would improve the probability that the majority is correct. So it'd even be better than just the situation where the 10,000 do it independently of the one genius, right? And then a third question about whether or not the society should incorporate that genius. It makes total sense, because they add that person as a 10,001 individual and their judgments are independent and so forth, then it will increase the probability of correctness. But yeah, they have an incentive to do this. So one way of looking at this is that this is like an epistemic solution to the collective action problem. So if a society has institutions that promote sufficiently honest, knowledgeable, independent judgments among individuals, then large enough collective judgments will be better than individual judgments. And we have some kind of real world examples of this. So it's widely acknowledged that Neanderthals had slightly larger brains than humans, Homo sapiens. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply that they were smarter, but it could be potentially, right? But they did tend to live in smaller groups than Homo sapiens. If I could be getting this wrong because I'm not an expert in anthropology. If I recall correctly, I think Neanderthals tended to have groups of about 10 to 30, and humans tended to, as hunter-gatherers, tend to have groups of 50 to 100. And so it's been suggested, there's a book called Humankind. And basically it argues that one of the things it argues is that the collective intelligence of Homo sapiens allowed Homo sapiens to supersede Neanderthals. But another way of looking at this is potentially the idea that we have an epistemic basis for the notion of what's the good, right? With much, much more work. Again, this is like speculations here. We could potentially contend that the good is that which tends toward sustaining of self-improving institutions that promote honesty, knowledge, and independence in an ever-enlarging scope of sentient agents, hopefully eventually encompassing all sentient agents across time and space, to improve our collective judgments and decisions. For example, Condorcet justified a free press and universally free education because that would lead to better collective judgment. He justified contract law because he thought that would improve collective judgments. He justified voting by mail, improving collective judgments. So all these ideas that we a lot of times think of as rights, liberties, there's a justification from its ability to improve epistemic judgment. Again, I think this is a much more complicated than this, but it's a potential starting point for a judgment. So at this point, I think it's speculation, but I think it's worth a route to think about. So in the end, I hope I've convinced you that approval voting is significantly better for making, okay, yeah. Wait, let me get to the last slide. All right, yeah. So I think approval voting is significantly better for improving a single winner group decision-making. And having it adopted more widespread is, I think, a very important goal, useful goal. I think Condorcet and Condorcet's jury theorem are very useful concepts for popular discourse, for promoting intelligent cooperation. And then I think also that Condorcet multi-agent systems can be a very useful framing tool for policymaking discourse. Because a lot of times, like when you get to the technical aspects of these things, a lot of it goes into machine learning and these black box decision making. And it's hard for, I think, the public or policymakers to wrap their heads around it. And so these could be tools to help them wrap their heads around some of these discussions. And I think these are ideas worth investing into making people more aware of them, and perhaps having a book about it or things of that nature. All right. I am open to questions, my friends.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is great. I love the book teaser at the end of it. Jamie already has a question. Maybe you go first, Jamie?
Sure. Though I admit that this is a very not productive, but rather selfish question. I just want to say I absolutely loved everything about your presentation. And my only question is, what's your bandwidth like? Because I run a collective intelligence institute and we built many tools around decision making and like scaling representation and deliberation. I just want to show you and like understand like where some of our work and where some of our assumptions may be existing in the literature.
Yeah. I'm glad to talk at some time. At the very beginning, I gave my email at the very beginning of this
got it.
thing. Oh, you saw it? Okay, fair enough.
Yep.
Yes. And so, yeah, if you have any, feel free to reach out. I'm glad to potentially talk. Yeah.
I guess if I wanted to make a contribution to the group, I could ask, do you have any opinion on also changing the voting structure from like people electing individuals as representatives of ideas as opposed to people just electing ideas themselves? You mentioned like being confronted with statements and a process of aggregating those up. So what if we made it so that like policy was more an aggregation of sentiments as opposed to an election of representatives?
So more direct democracy as opposed to. So I think it varies from and again, this is where I think the whole idea of Condorcet multi-agent systems becomes more useful than just talking about Condorcet. I think Condorcet and the jury theorem are useful for public discourse. The nuance of like when you should use direct democracy versus representative democracy, I think is very much dependent on the specific context. And this is where the multi-agent systems approach can be very useful. I think situations get complicated enough that in terms of running a state, you probably need some form of representative democracy. That you could have, for example, one possibility is like you could have a bicameral situation where one town is just done based on representative individuals selected by representative elections, like roughly as they've done now with different mechanisms to choose, but like election methods to choose. Then also some people could be chosen by sortition. I don't know well, you're probably familiar with sortition. But sortition is basically the idea that you choose random members of the population to form and one thing people worry about, what if you get an absolute crazy person? I think, and one way I think of solving this is have people each vote for, and again, there's the exact details would be very dependent on specific questions, but if you had this kind of sortition mechanism, what you would do is you'd have, say, people would each vote for one party, right? And then you get, say, let's say 55% of people vote for Democrats, 45% vote for Republicans. Then what you would do is you say, okay, we'd say, okay, if there's 100 seats, then we'd have 55 of the seats would go to people who identify as Democrats, and then 45 of the seats would go to people who identify as Republicans. And they would be randomly chosen from those subsets of the population. So then you can make sure that each party has representation in accordance to their proportion. Again, there's several different ways and different mechanisms. This is where analysis of the very specific situations becomes very important.
All right, good for now. Then next one up, we have Blake. I'm going to read out your question. Is a truth-seeking multi-agent system sufficient, or do we also want a decision-making system?
Could you clarify what your distinction between those two ideas are, just so I have an idea of what you're asking?
Just I think it was in the jury theorem, you mentioned like we want this truth-seeking multi-agent system, and it was just like a nitpick, honestly. I was like, yeah, but seeking truth is only one part of the equation. What about taking action? And yeah, honestly, this is maybe not my biggest question, but I think it leads into a bigger question of just how are multi-agent systems actually useful in social choice? I think you've alluded to that this is a general good direction to go in, but to me, it seems like still a fuzzy, broad direction. I'm trying to see, besides better voting systems like approval voting, besides averaging large numbers of people to get the right answer, what are the ways that we should think about what general paradigm to apply these systems? So the question I wrote in the chat is...
Okay, so I'll to your first question about also needing decision mechanisms. Yes, I agree. And it varies on context, but I think I'll answer some of that when I answer your second question about what directions we need to go. So historically, for the most part, the big contributions in social choice have been like possibility and impossibility theorems and showing that voting systems satisfy certain conditions. What I think we need to move towards more probabilistic and statistical models for decision making and assessing voting mechanisms. And one thing about Condorcet multi-agent systems is, and I mentioned this in my EA Global talk, is that basically they're almost certainly they're going to be computationally intractable in worst case scenario in terms of finding the optimal aggregation mechanism given any background condition, things of that nature. And I think what's useful is akin to what's useful in a lot of computation theory and algorithms is like finding more efficient ways of doing it. Like we can't solve the traveling salesman problem, but we can find better approximation algorithms. And I think what would be useful is, okay, we make these formal models of Condorcet multi-agent systems. And then we say, okay, in this particular situation, what are good approximation algorithms for figuring out how to change the background conditions to make a particular method of aggregation work, or figuring out what's the best aggregation method given this set of background conditions. So I think moving into an algorithmic approximation approach is a very useful direction to go in at this point from the technical research standpoint. And see who's next, Alison.
Excellent up. We have Jazir.
Hello, Jazir.
Hey, great talk. I was thinking a lot basically about the bully example with the teacher, where the teacher basically is like a perfect oracle versus the genius, where the genius is actually quite sophisticated, but the crowd outperforms him. And I think there's a huge tension with that. One, there's geniuses, Satoshi Nakamoto or Miyoshi, the guy who created the ABC conjecture or who proved it, Mochizuki, and Wolfram kind of is misplaced. There are a lot of areas where people figure something out and it may take the crowd a long time to even validate that they're correct. Like you don't know what the percentages are of the crowd knowing the underlying and the genius knowing the underlying. And this is a real problem with markets because private information or obscure information is essentially what decides winners and losers in the market. So I'm just wondering, have you thought about games where the underlying probability is unknown of who's a genius and who's not, or situations where it changes over time in context as the market evolves, stuff like that?
I personally haven't done too much research on that, but I think it's very important and interesting. One thing I've thought about that has been, I haven't seen discussed as much is, and this is actually something I didn't incorporate into the discussion of the model, but so for example, take somebody like Elon Musk or I think Vladimir Putin is actually a very good example of this. I don't think Vladimir Putin's a very good person. Yeah, he's a very horrible person, in fact, but I do think it's true that he's very smart. I think he's probably, just in terms of intelligence, I think he's probably the smartest world leader right now, right? Now, that said, think about like his decision-making, say 20 years ago when he first came to power, right? So he hadn't had people who'd been loyal to him for 20 some odd years or whatnot. And he wasn't as big of a deal. There were less demands on his time. So he had more time to figure out. There were less people demanding his time to think about things. And then also the people who he was using as source of information had only been his lackeys for relatively short periods of time. And so he hadn't sorted them out as much. And so he did, in terms of his goals, not necessarily that his goals were good, but in terms of his goal, he was very successful in terms of getting control of the oligarchs to make them do what he wanted them to do. And he was very good at putting down the rebellion in Chechnya. And this was basically within the first 5 years of his control of Russia. But today, think about the situation, right? He's basically vetted 20 years of people to drop out people who are not loyal, because even if they're better judgment makers, if they're loyal, they're less likely to overthrow him, right? And he's also going to be much more of an information bubble, and he has much less time to spend on any particular question, right? So as somebody gets into that situation, even if he's still as smart as he was 20 years ago, even if we assume there's no cognitive decline, he clearly made a huge miscalculation in terms of Ukraine and about thinking that he could actually take it over, because he had very bad sources of information, and a lot of the top leaders he's dealing with, they're more loyal than they are necessarily competent. And I think you can see this a lot with, for example, I think Elon Musk is a very smart person, but he clearly has less time to spend on any given thing he's thinking about today than he did, say, 20 years ago. And also, he's also going to be trapped in his own information bubble to a greater extent than he was in the past, because a lot of times people will be less frank with him now than they would be in the past. So this affects even people this is something that I think is a common pattern in terms of people who are really good at making decision making. And that's a very quick, actually, I do want to continue talking. So please shoot me an email, Jazir. I would like to talk about this more. But yeah, it's something definitely worth thinking about.
Sure. I can do a quick follow-up and then I'll send you an email. I think in the market, what you're talking about is basically alpha decay. So you used to have good signal or alpha and now you no longer do. And the other is that there's some research from Michael Jordan, the famous machine learning researcher, on getting more information out. It addresses this problem, but I will email you the paper. I'll post in the chat, but I'll follow up with you later.
Oh, thanks.
Cool. Next up, we have Shadi.
Hi. Yeah, excellent talk. Definitely. Yeah, I got a lot out of it. Would be curious to hear a little bit more on how you're considering the interplay between independence, knowledge, and honesty. Is it a rule of thumb heuristic, or are there some particularly useful algorithms that we could think of or use? And what's the best way to reduce independence is to think of degrees of freedom of a particular agent. And specifically, sorry, I hope you're with me here still. And specifically, when it comes to putting an unbounded cap on degrees of freedom of an agent, at what point do you lead to trade-offs between how much knowledge that agent can acquire, or how much knowledge other agents can acquire? So I guess I'm just thinking about the complexity of the trade-off between different agents, depending on the degrees of freedom that they have, if that's how you're conceiving of it.
So this is a good question, because it's a question I don't know the answer to. And I think this is where a lot of technical research can be done to better address this question. Because again, this is where I think actually formalizing these models and actually, okay, making a concrete model and then saying what's good in this situation, what's bad in this situation, and then doing that across several formal models and saying, okay, what's the pattern we see here, and figuring out like how to actually answer these. I think the answers will also be heuristics as opposed to a general algorithm to find the optimal solution. Because I do think it has been mathematics, but I do think they're most likely intractable. But yeah, these are questions I don't know the exact answers to. And I think at this point, my best advice is like a case by case kind of basis type thing. And I think better answers can be developed with better technical research on these questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. Just a little add on there. Do you think that it's useful to have a taxonomy of problem statements or scenarios based off of whether it's goal invariant, where you have agents and the goal is not known, and the agents must share information to decide or collectively drive on a goal, as opposed to a goal-directed scenario where the goal is explicitly defined or can be inferred from the properties of the environment? And then last, and I guess you could break those two up as well, explicit definition versus inference of particular goal.
Again, like I don't know a general rule of thumb for that kind of situation. Again, I think it's something that's going to have to be case by case based. And I think further research will actually give a better answer than any answer I'm giving right now.
Very interesting to think about either way. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that some of you want to ask follow-up questions. So if that's the case, just raise your hand again or indicate it to me. Otherwise, I'm going to ask you like our kind of like foresight questions that usually like people are pretty much interested in across the board. One of them is, if you think about like the implications of this work in 5 years or something, where do you think it has the biggest impact? Like if, let's say, your research continues as it does, which kind of fields do you feel like maybe revolutionizing? Definitely has some AI implications too. Yeah, there's a lot kind of in terms of future implications. And I know that you already had some speculation slides on there, but if you were to pinpoint it more, what would you think?
In terms of the next 5 years, I think we would probably getting approval voting adopted in more jurisdictions, because most of the scientific community, like when I say social choice, the greatest consensus is around the idea that approval voting for single winner decision-making, group decision-making is probably the best in most situations. And having it adopted in more jurisdictions would be a very big plug, because it's already been adopted in St. Louis and in Fargo, and they're currently doing a work on a statewide campaign in Missouri, which has gotten good level support from people in Congress and from statewide Republican leaders in Missouri. So that in terms of the next 5 years, I think greater adoption of approval voting would be a really big push. And I think the biggest bottleneck for that right now is primarily, and this is one of the reasons I focus a lot on public policymaking and public discourse, because I think the biggest bottleneck for approval voting is the amount of, because I think there's probably only something on the order of, say, maybe $5 million spent in the last 5 years on the issue. And I think if you had it at a larger scale, like $100 million, you would have a huge exponential scale. I think before gains for each additional dollar spent moves from exponential to linear, I think you'd have to go to somewhere between 100 million and $1 billion before you get to where it switches to linear gains from exponential gains for each additional dollar spent. So that's in the next 5 years, what I see is just more adoption in more jurisdictions. I know in India, there's a big push to have it also. And then in the very long run, I think the idea of thinking about society as an effort to make better and better judgments and to aggregate information, promoting institutions that promote honesty and knowledge and independent thinking among as many sentient entities as possible. I think in the very long run, I think that I don't feel I have a super strong argument to prove that, but I feel speculatively, my sense of that would be the direction to get us to be cooperative so we don't destroy each other before we're able to reap all the benefits of really strong AI.
Yeah, that's great. Just sticking around. Make the fun decisions to stick longer around. Love it. Last one for me is if people are excited about your work and want to support you, like what's up next for you? And you alluded to a book or something. I don't know.
I would really
If you
like
have
to write a book. So if you want to send me money or you want to tell me where you think I can get money to sit down and write a book or find a publisher, call me, email me. I am more
You should
than glad.
absolutely join. Do you know the Progress Fellowship, the new Progress Fellowship? I'm not sure if it comes with the monetary reward, but it's basically for writers that are progress oriented and have a different take on decision making and institutional frameworks to advance progress oriented projects. And I would definitely welcome you to check it out. I think
If you could shoot me an email for that, I'd greatly appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, will do. All right. Thank you, everyone. This was really fun. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad we finally made it work. It was really worth it. I learned a ton. And I don't think I had put all of the different concepts together in the way that you just did. So that was really inspiring. Thanks a lot. Best of luck with all of your endeavors. And thanks everyone for your amazing questions. It was really fun, this one.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your time and your effort. If you ever want to reach me, please feel free to email me. My email address is M as in Mary, R as in Robert, P as in Paul, R as in Robert, A as in Apple, S as in Sam, A as in Apple, D as in dog, at berkeley.edu. If I didn't get to answer your question, I'd love to answer it. Just please shoot me an email. I greatly appreciate it. And if I mentioned to you earlier that I'd love to hear from you specifically, Jeff, please shoot me an email again also.
Cool. I also added your email address again here in the chat. So thanks everyone for joining. Have a wonderful weekend, I guess, almost. And see you very soon. Bye-bye.